Welcome back and welcome to session 6. Let's begin with the Martin Luther quote for the week. It's not one that is especially happy looking for a pastor, but I decided I would choose it because of today's topic. Shall we pray? Compassionate God, I wish I could ask Brother Martin what he meant by suffering. Since I can't, I will assume that he meant that the time he spent in prayer and study enabled him to rightly connect with your people who suffer, so that he could be a means by which your compassionate care was experienced. Grant this to me and all who serve in your name. Amen. So I've been trying in this series so far to follow chronologically the events of Martin Luther's life and his role in the Reformation. And while the dates for this particular session are 1531 to 1541, we're going to wander all the way back to probably about 1523 and all the way forward to at least 1544, because Luther's work as a pastor and a hymn writer and a liturgical reformer did not start after the presentation of the Augsburg Confession in 1530. Those things were going on throughout his career, so we will be jumping all over the place today. We're going to start with his work as a pastor, and I've got a couple of new words for you today. Believe it or not, they're not Greek or Hebrew, they're German, and here's the first one. Anybody? Well, this is the German translation of a Latin phrase. Maybe that helps. Maybe not. So to move to the English, Seelsorge is often translated the cure of souls. That's perhaps a closer literal translation, more often as pastoral care. And in the life of Martin Luther, it was not what we would call the controversial works, the 95 Theses, the Babylonian captivity of the church, the bondage of the will. It was not those works which we consider his controversial ones, the ones that scholars look at all the time, as the ones that were the most popular. It was actually his pastoral care type writings that were much more popular. For example, in Luther's lifetime, the 95 Theses existed in just a handful of editions, whereas this is the cover piece of a sermon on indulgence and grace. You can find that in 23 different editions. And that made him not only a very popular writer, it made him very popular with the printing presses of the day. I'm told that at the time of the 95 Theses, there were but 2 printing houses in Wittenberg, and they were both struggling. And by the time of Luther's death, there were 6, and they couldn't keep up with printing all of his stuff. And Luther was a pastor, in addition to being a preacher and a teacher. And it's out of his own spiritual struggles that we've talked about along the way that he was able to connect with people in a very uncanny way, speaking to the spiritual needs of his contemporaries and his colleagues even, in many cases. So the care of souls was a driving force in Luther's personal development and as he turned toward the people that he served. So here comes your second German word for the session. There we go, that's a goodie, huh? Anfechtung. And there's the word spelled out. There's the word in picture form. And some words just simply defy adequate translation from one language to another. I've many times in the setting of a Bible study challenged people to give me a one-word English translation of the Spanish word enchilada, and I've never heard one yet. Anfechtung would be the same kind of a word. It offers a big challenge to translate from German into English. If you read through writers on Luther, you will find a variety of translations for this word. One writer uses the word temptation, which points to the Christian's life as a period of testing by Satan In this temptation, the Christian is given the opportunity by God to overcome Satan personally, but there's, of course, never any suggestion that God is the origin of the sin or provokes the Christian to sin. Another writer translates Anfechtung as trials. A trial suggests a probationary period before God bestows some great good. Another writer, affliction. It doesn't happen, this suffering, through chance. It's a real suffering and a real pain, but not physical pain, but rather pain in the soul, anxious about one's status before God and their salvation. The American translation of Luther's works uses all three: temptation, trial, and affliction, plus tribulation. Tribulation refers to the Christian suffering during this, and I would use the translation dark night of the soul, which comes out of Christian mysticism maybe a century later. Nevertheless, this is where Luther struggled with his search for a God who would smile at him, and fearing that he would never find that God who would only judge him, led to this Anfechtung, this dark night of the soul, this sense of trial and tribulation. And this was something that was shared by lots of people in lots of ways in the time. From an illustrated book called The Art of Dying, this first woodcut shows the kind of anxiety people faced. This illustration shows a set of demons with crowns in their hands, crowns being a symbol of earthly pride, trying to tempt this dying man to turn his back on God and reach for some earthly prizes. And if you are able to see it and you look carefully, you will notice it looks like he has the thumb of his left hand hooked around one of the offered crowns, which is making the three characters in the back of the scene, on the left, Mary, in the center, Jesus, and on the far right, the Father. Of course, it's a bearded man for the Father, never mind. They aren't looking especially happy with what's going on here. But here's another image from the same type of work showing a different outcome. There is a man who has just died, who's been handed a candle, the light of Christ, by a nearby priest, and his soul is being received by the angel above. The soul in the sense depicted as a little person being lifted up. Down below, the demons are upset because they've lost another possible customer or victim, and standing over the whole scene is, of course, Christ on the cross. This idealizes the art of dying well, a soul that is at peace. Over against this backdrop of the spiritual needs of the people of his time and Luther's own struggle, probably one of the most important places Luther did his pastoral care was in his preaching. The Reformation gave centrality to the sermon, and where they were able to do so, Lutherans, the Reformers, gave the pulpit the highest place in the room. Now, we understand that virtually all the churches that became Lutheran, if you will, were originally Roman Catholic churches, and all of them had raised pulpits, not so much for symbolic reasons, but for acoustic reasons. But as we'll see later, the first church built by the Reformers also had a raised pulpit to symbolize the Word stands above all. And the Reformers, along with Luther, undertook an extensive campaign of religious education and therefore also pastoral care through the sermon. In Wittenberg, there were 3 public services on Sunday. The first service from 5 a.m. to 6 in the morning. The sermons in those services were on Paul's letters. The second service was from 9 to 10 in the morning. That sermon would be on the Gospels. And in an afternoon service at different hours, the sermon might continue on the theme of one of the morning services or pick up on the catechism. But the church was not locked during the week. On Mondays and Tuesdays, there were sermons on the catechism. On Wednesdays, the sermons were on the Gospel of Matthew. Thursdays and Fridays, the sermons were on the letters of the rest of the apostles' letters in the New Testament. On Saturday evening, the sermons were on John's Gospel. So in other words, we'll have no more complaining about the worship schedule here at Mount Cross, lest we reform our worship schedule and go back to the 15th century series that Wittenberg was having. Now, please understand, Luther was not carrying this whole load himself. There were many pastors who were sharing it. Nevertheless, it is understood that we have about 2,300 of his sermons that exist. That's not to say that he might not have preached off the cuff, and there might even be more. His preeminence in the pulpit had to do with the way he connected with people because of his own struggles. And he found himself continually repeating to himself the advice that he gave to a discouraged preacher who complained that preaching was a burden and his sermons were always too short, and maybe he should have stayed in his former profession. Luther told him, "If Peter and Paul were here, they would scold you because you wish right off to be as accomplished as they. Crawling is something, even if one is unable to walk. Do your best. If you cannot preach an hour, then preach half an hour, or a quarter of an hour. Do not try to imitate other people. Center on the shortest and simplest points, which are the very heart of the matter, and leave the rest to God. Look solely to God's honor and not to applause. Pray that God will give you a mouth and your audience ears. I can tell you, preaching is not a work of man. Although I am old," he was 48 at the time he wrote this, "and I am experienced, I am afraid every time I have to preach." Luther's sermons followed the course prescribed by the Christian year, the lectionary, which was a one-year lectionary, and he didn't make changes in this. And because he often spoke at the 9 o'clock service, his sermons are mostly on the Gospels rather than what his favorites were, the letters of Paul. Year after year he preached through the whole cycle, but you're amazed when you read them how fresh each one is each time he came around to the same text another year. One interesting feature of Luther's sermons, however, is how abrupt the conclusions were and how they segued immediately into the announcements, which, as you'll hear, sometimes went on as long as the sermon might have. One example I'll give you from a sermon on the 8th of November in 1528. It's from the parable of the servant who was forgiven a huge debt by his Lord. The last words of the sermon, if you will, are, "And the Lord in the parable does not tell the servant to found a monastery, but simply that he should have mercy on his fellow servants. But now what shall I say to you Wittenbergers? It would be better that I preached to you the imperial law, because you want to be Christians while still practicing usury, robbing, and stealing. How do people who are so sunk in sins expect to receive forgiveness? The sword of the emperor really applies here, but my sermon is for crushed hearts who feel their sins and have no peace." Enough for this gospel. I understand that this is the week for the church collection, and many of you do not want to give a thing. You ungrateful people should be ashamed of yourselves. You Wittenbergers have been relieved of schools and hospitals, which have been taken over by the common chest, and now you want to know why you are asked to give 4 pennies. They are for the ministers, the school teachers, and the sacristans. The first labor for your salvation, preach to you the precious treasure of the gospel, administer the sacraments, and visit you at great personal risk in the plague. The second, train children to be good magistrates, judges, and ministers. The third, care for the poor. So far the common chest has cared for these, and now that you are asked to give 4 miserable pennies, you are up in arms? What does this mean, if not that you do not want the gospel preached, the children taught, and the poor helped? I am not saying this for myself. I receive nothing from you. I am the prince's beggar. But I am sorry I ever freed you from the tyrants and the papists. You ungrateful beasts, you are not worthy of the treasure of the gospel. If you don't improve, I will stop preaching rather than cast pearls before the swine. And now on another point, couples to be blessed by the associate pastor before a wedding should come early. There are stated hours, in summer mornings at 8 and afternoons at 3, in winter mornings at 9 and afternoons at 2. If you come later, I will bless you myself, and you won't thank me for it. And the invited guests should prepare themselves in good time for the wedding, and let not Miss Goose wait for Mrs. Duck. So, the centrality of Christ in his preaching and everything he did, of course, symbolized by this illustration. And the raised pulpit, as we talked about, and we'll talk about again. He had, and there's an illustration again, another raised pulpit, Christ in the center again, and all the sacraments being administered. We'll come back to talking about worship as we go. But as important as worship in the church was concerned for him, as important for him was worship in the home and nurturing the faith in the home. So much so, and these are a couple of illustrations I have that capture this moment with Luther and the children, and this guy on the left hanging out, because that's the wife in the bonnet. There's Martin standing and praying, and the kids there. Who is that guy on the left? That's Philip Melanchthon, who was his right-hand man for so many things, and apparently hung out with his family a lot. So he gets in a lot of pictures like this. But so important was what happened at home is they were bound volumes of Luther's sermons, house postilla, house sermons. So they were bound up so that you could even read those sermons at home. And in a way, we do that. We send copies of the printed sermon to several homes of our church that are shut in. And all of you, if you have access to the internet, can see the printed sermon every week and hear the worship service on the internet. So we do a similar thing. Occasionally, I've bound up a set of sermons on a theme, summer theme or something, put those together. But so it's an idea that continues.
Where do we get his sermons?
Well, you can probably go online, for one thing, type in Luther's sermons. Some libraries have copies of Luther's works, and you can find a lot of sermons in there. They're around. So another way, and perhaps in addition to all the preaching he did, he wrote letters to all kinds of people, and through the letters he expressed his care for souls and the support that people needed. The picture on the right even suggests that he was writing in the midst of his own as well as others' anfechtung, that torment of the spirit, the threats of demons or whatever, trying to rescue people from their fears of such things, was the context in which he wrote. And that's a collection, a 6-volume collection of the letters that we have. Now, presumably, not everybody saved their letters from Martin Luther, and there might be even more, but that's how many letters he wrote over the course of his ministry. And in a lot of these letters, I'll mention, a lot of what he had to say, pastorally speaking, was also recorded at the table where he ate. And this is the table and the room in the old monastery in Wittenberg that was given to him and Katie, his wife, after their marriage. It was actually a wedding present from the elector. And all the monks that used to live in the cells were rented out, not the monks weren't rented out, the cells were rented out for students in the university there, who then often sat at table with Martin and the family, and many of them had their notebooks, and they just waited for more pearls to fall from this guy's mouth, and they wrote them down and saved them. And many of the things that you'll see in some of these quotes coming up were collected in various volumes of his table talk. Tischreden is the German. And a lot of them had to do with the devil, because the devil was a lively figure in Luther's life and in the lives of the people of the time. He said, when I go to bed, the devil is always waiting for me. When he begins to plague me, I give him this answer. Devil, I must sleep. That's God's command. Work by day, sleep by night. So go away. If that doesn't work, he brings out a catalog of sins. I say, yes, old fellow, I know all about it. And I know some more you've overlooked. Here are a few extra. Put them down. If he still won't quit and presses me hard and accuses me as a sinner, I scorn him and say, Saint Satan, pray for me. Of course, you have never done anything wrong in your life. You alone are holy. Go to God and get grace for yourself. If you want me to get all straightened out, I say, physician, heal thyself. Well, there's one of his letters. And as you know, as you may know, there's a legendary moment when he was in the Wartburg Castle translating the Bible that the devil appeared to him and he threw an inkwell at him and left a stain on the wall. And that has been reproduced in many different sorts of artworks. A couple more will show up, more letters. He also suggests that you not try to argue with the devil. He wrote, he has had 5,000 years of experience. He's tried out all his tricks on Adam, Abraham, and David, and he knows exactly your weak spots, and he is persistent. If he does not get you down with the first assault, he will continue with a siege of attrition until you give in from sheer exhaustion. Better banish the whole subject, seek company, and discuss some irrelevant matter, as, for example, what is going on in Venice. Shun solitude. Eve got in trouble when she walked alone, and so on. So there's more letters, more images of him heaving the inkwell at the devil. He had several rules, or not rules, but prescriptions for chasing the devil away. Music was probably number one. Well, actually, fellowship was number one. Get with people. The devil gets you alone, he'll win. Get with people, he's got no chance. Music was great because the devil hates gaiety. Luther's physician related one time he came to a party and was all despondent, but when the music started, Luther was the life of the party. Home life is a diversion. Having a wife that you can ask for help was a good thing. Manual labor, even a relief. He wrote, to exercise the devil, the best, let's say, a good way to exercise the devil is to harness the horse and spread manure on the fields. Now, I wasn't looking carefully as I was collecting images of Luther throwing the ink pot at the devil, and I took a closer look at this one, and lo and behold, that's Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, that's
right?
Doesn't it look like?
It is. Well, the caption says Martin Luther Roosevelt on the bottom.
Oh.
I don't know where this comes from or what the circumstances are, but the devil is wanting to present him with a crown of some sort of glory, and he is mimicking Luther and saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Be interesting to find out where that comes from. So he had all this list of remedies, including this one. Down-to-earth guy. And there are more quotes like that, I guess. So anyway, through his letters and his table talk, he provided counsel for people to try and bring them out. Does anybody know what that is?
The gas mask?
You're not far off. It's a plague mask. Starting in the 1300s, the Black Death was roaming Europe and made a visit to Wittenberg later on in the 1500s. But to treat people, or at least deal with people who had the plague, it was thought at the time that the plague was passed by bad air. They didn't know the thing about the rodents and the viruses or whatever it actually was. So to protect yourself, you had this big old suit, and the beak was stuffed full of spices and herbs and such to keep good air in your face so that you didn't get bad air and get sick with the plague. Well, the plague came to Wittenberg in 1527, and fearing for the safety of Luther and the others in the university, the elector said, "Get out of town. Run to some safe place where the plague isn't present." Luther didn't go. As the plague approached, he got one of his bouts of depression and was kind of immobilized. In the meantime, I think the plague must have come nearby, and he got asked by people all kinds of questions. What should we do? And he started a letter back to this person, which was interrupted twice, once because he was depressed, and the second time because the plague arrived. But he finally, after it was over, finished the piece and sent it off, and it was called "Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague." And what he wrestled with was, how do I, a servant of the Good Shepherd, who is not the hireling, who will not run from the sheep, handle caring for the Lord's sheep? And he said, I should stay. I should stay and take care of the sheep. So should the rulers. So should even the servants, unless released by their masters. You should not put yourself in danger. We should have hospitals and health care and so on, but it was his conviction that he should stay put and not run off. So the letter actually was after the plague had abated, but it still, because it could come back, of course. And but he still wrestled with that particular issue. Again, part of his pastoral care for people, colleagues even, out of the area. And I've got your hymnals on the table. I want you to open up to number 600. which was actually written a couple of years before the plague got to Wittenberg. I tried and did not succeed in finding the occasion for the hymn itself, but it could very well have been, knowing that the plague was nearby and the possibility of it coming could have inspired the writing of this hymn. So you're going to hear it sung, the first verse in German, and you can follow along with the English translation, number 600. Words and music by Martin Luther. So, transitioning from pastoral care to the work he did on liturgy, this is one of my favorite questions to ask in settings like this. What does the word liturgy mean? I've asked this question a million times in Conference. Yes! The work of the people. For a lot of people it means ritual. For some people it means dead ritual. For some people it means the kind of ritual that you can do while you're thinking about something else. What we do every week, always the same, never changing, and so on, but it really means the work of the people. For us as a community of faith, the liturgy begins as we gather on the first day of the week. Our nearly first active liturgy is in that building over there usually, and includes what we call our worship service. When the doors open and you're sent out, the liturgy doesn't stop. The work of the people continues through all the rest of the week. Or at least it should, if we're equipping you for your work properly. So Luther went to work on changing, and now I'll speak of liturgy as the worship service, and what goes on in the worship service more specifically. Churches of the time had become rather glorious. This is the Frauenkirche in Dresden, which is the Lutheran cathedral in Dresden, which we were in. That's my photograph of it. That's what it looks like today. That's what it looked like in 1945 after the Allies bombed the smithereens out of the city of Dresden for no particular reason. And there is, and there was, a statue of Martin Luther. There are a couple of versions of this photograph. The one I have on a postcard that I bought in Dresden when we were there shows Martin Luther face down. Somebody came along and at least rolled him over. The church looked like that until the early 2000s. The whole time that East Germany was in charge, we don't want to build another church. We don't have any reason to build a church. They were nominally supportive of the churches that existed, so to speak, to give the appearance of not being anti-religious, but they didn't really want to rebuild anything like this. It was the citizens of Dresden who mobilized among themselves and the greater community around to rebuild it, and I got to tell you, it's a spectacular story to watch. I was leaving. I had wandered all over Dresden that day. I'd seen more churches and more stuff, and I was going to go back to the hotel when I ran into two others from the tour who said they're going back to see the film that they're showing in the cavernous lower part about how they restored the cathedral, and it's just jaw-dropping. Because it looked like that, and now it looks like this.
Did they have plans for this, or did
They did find plans. They did find plans, and if you look at the outside of the dome and so on, you'll see dark and light stones because they cut what they could from the rubble to restore it. Well, it's interesting because in the time of the Reformation, something similar happened. The so-called iconoclasts were, I've said this before, the Roman Catholic Church considered them the conservative right. Luther moved to the middle. To the Catholics, he was a radical left-winger. But what happened, especially while Luther was up at the Wartburg Castle, many others went farther to the left and got really radical and basically said, if it's Catholic, it ought to go. So they ran into a lot of churches with axes and sledgehammers and busted the statues, busted the stained glass windows, demolished the altars. killed the priests and nuns in some cases, because all of that smacked of Catholic, and we're not that anymore. Well, Luther was appalled, and he made a secret trip back from the Wartburg, got in his pulpit, and reamed those people out in a series of 8 sermons around Christmas time, before he officially came back to Wittenberg later. It was not his way to just take stuff away. He was a fan of the Mass, and he was a fan of order. He was very conservative with regards to most things. So this photograph, not a photograph, a painting, is not of what the Frauenkirche looked like at any point. It's a symbol of the simplicity that the Reformers, in many cases, were able to bring to new church construction, as well as simplifying some of the structures, especially if they've been gutted previously. But more, and we'll come back to architecture in a minute, but the most important part of the worship service was what was going on in Holy Communion for Luther. The whole Mass, he thought, was a beautiful way to worship God. And you'll know that, well, you'll recognize that if you go to a Roman Catholic church and you do the traditional service here at Mount Cross, what's the difference? It virtually is the same. There was one big section that was a big difference, though, and that was what's called the canon of the Mass. Now, on the slide, this is the priest always had his back to you, probably pretty far away. If you've been in any of those big cathedrals, it's miles away, it seems like, before you, from the first pew to the altar. There's huge gaps. And he's up there at the altar.
During the sermon to be heard.
Not that they ever preached much. This is prior to any reform in the Catholic Church. So, because this moment at the altar is what you're there for, the communion. And he was standing at the altar with his back to you, and the text that you're going to see flying by on the screen is called the canon of the Mass. And these are all the words that the priest would say silently at the altar, so you couldn't hear it. And don't try to read it because it's going to go too fast, but I'm just giving you a visual of how much the priest said, either silently or under his breath. In Latin, of course. So you're a German in the church, having all this go on and on and on and on and on, while he's up there doing his mumbo-jumbo or his hocus-pocus. In fact, that's where that comes from. The words, hoc est corpus meum, this is my body, hocus corpus, hocus pocus. I believe that's where that came from. All of that, until we get to the Lord's Prayer, then you get a chance to participate. And all that text was what was Luther's number one enemy in the worship service, because that text is where the priest is taking the body, the bread and wine, and changing it into the body and blood of Christ, so it can be sacrificed anew. As if to say, Jesus died on the cross, that's fine, but we've got to crucify him again for the sins you've done since the last time you were at Mass. And the next, and the next. And so it's a continual sacrifice of Christ. And Luther said, ain't no way. He died once for all sins. And so that whole section of the service, in the dumpster. And so from that point, pastors would turn to be seen and heard. They would, what we call the words of institution, would be at least as much as you would hear. Often a little bit more, but it's all about thanksgiving and honoring Christ, not sacrificing Christ in any way any further. There's another illustration of the pulpit raised up nice and high, again, probably for acoustic reasons, but also because, again, still these are churches that were in existence, the pulpits were already high. All of them that I saw were way up in the air. And I would have loved to have climbed into every single one just to see if I fit. Because I've only been in one historic pulpit. It's the pulpit of the old Muskego Church, which is the first church built on this continent by Norwegian immigrants. I think it was in Muskego, Wisconsin, at least I believe that's where. And they moved it onto the grounds of Luther Seminary. So graduation weekend, they had it open. And I thought, I'm going to go up there. And I climbed, and this pulpit is nearly to the top of the building. And when I got in there, my head was touching the ceiling. Anyway, Luther got asked questions about all kinds of things by those who regarded him now as the expert or the leader. How long should I preach? Try not to preach more than an hour, he said. So be grateful. He was asked questions about, so
to keep an eye on the time,
Oh, there you go.
check out the hourglass system that they had for monitoring the length of sermon. So,
I love it.
I'm not sure how it worked, but that looks very beautiful. He was asked questions about baptism, experiences that were going on in other places in Saxony. Apparently, there was a group of Christians who were having baptisms for children that weren't even born yet. He said, no, you cannot do that. That's long before the Mormons started doing that sort of weird stuff. Another set of baptisms was happening by midwives who were baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, but not using water. He said, no, that's got to have water. There were emergency baptisms performed by midwives where there was no water, so they used wine. Now, I'd like to be dunked in that kind of baptism. Luther said, I'm not going to object, but it'd be nice to have it baptized in water when we get a chance. Another thing that I read, it said, and I don't know what this means, Luther had no reservations about baptizing with warm water. I don't know what that means. I put warm water in the font before we had our temperature control in the sanctuary so well, and the water was really cold some winters, and the kids would just sort of questions were asked, what do we do with all the bread and wine that was left after the sacrament? Well, in Rome, in 1510, when Luther went on a mission for the monastery, if you've been in one of these big cathedrals, like the one I showed you, there's the main altar, but then there are chapels all around the building. And each chapel would have an altar, and there'd be a priest at each of those altars all day long doing a mass for your grandmother and your uncle and your mother and so on. And every time the mass is over, the priest would finish off the wine, start all over again. And by the end of the day, these priests were all drunk, and it scandalized Luther. So he said, it's okay, because technically, after the service is over, that's just bread and wine now. It's not the body and blood, so go ahead, whoever's there can finish it off. There were questions about elevating the cup or elevating the bread during the Mass. Is that too Catholic? Luther said, do whatever seems right. If that's familiar to people, don't take it away. He wanted them to be comfortable and familiar, but realize that things were different. And so his first attempt at revising the order of worship was called the Formula Mass, 1523. So that's really early for us. I mean, the Diet of Worms was 1521, so we're not that far into his career. He wrote, basically it's the Latin Mass with that one section that we threw away, taken away. And he was happy with that because he loved the Mass, and it was familiar to people, but it's still, you're Germans, I'm doing the service in Latin, you're familiar with it, but you don't really know it. And you might not even recognize that the part that was most odious to Luther is even missing, because you never understood in the first place. So eventually he realized we have to do a German Mass. So just 3 years later, this came out. And the whole thing was in German, with the exception of the Kyrie eleison. The Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. Which, I have to say, even now, we sometimes sing those words. And they have an ancient, sacred sense to them, which Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, doesn't quite have. And the thing I like about Kyrie eleison in the service is it also connects the Western Church with the Eastern Church, because Kyrie eleison is Greek, not Latin. And that connects with the whole Orthodox side of our faith, which Western Christianity just kind of ignores most of the time. But they're part of the family, even though we've had some feuds, but that's a whole other subject. In both cases, it was Luther's desire that you had an experience which allowed you to really fellowship with God and with each other. And in regards to the each other part, Luther rightly read St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, where he said in so many words, unless you discern the body when you're communing, you are bringing judgment down on your own head. And what I take that to mean is, I'll explain it by the way I teach kids in First Communion class. I first of all tell them, you are not required to make the sign of the cross at any point in your life. But if you do, here's what it means to me. When I do this part, I'm reminded that in communion, for example, God has said to me, we're good, you're forgiven, we're back on the same page. But when I touch my left shoulder and my right shoulder, I'm reminded I have a brother in Christ and a sister in Christ who are with me, part of the body of Christ. And if I don't recognize that, I haven't had communion. I can't go to communion and just look for me to be tight with God. That's not communion. Because Christ is in the world in his body. Unless I'm connected to the rest of his body, I did not have communion that day. That's how I take Paul. And Luther was keen on that part of it. So the German Mass, the Latin Mass did it up to a point, but the German Mass really aimed at that, and it was heavily on the teaching side throughout. I'm going to leave liturgy for a minute and talk about sacred architecture. In the city of Torgau, which is a little ways away from Wittenberg, happens to be the city where Katie Luther is buried. Martin is in Wittenberg. Katie died in Torgau and was buried in the city church in Torgau. This is the castle for the royal, the elector's family. Duke Frederick and those who were protective of Luther, who lived in Wittenberg in the castle there. Their family ancestral home is this castle. And to the left of it is this building, which in 1544 houses, if you go in through this door, there's that door, houses the very first building, or the very first chapel built for Protestant worship in the Reformation. Previous to this, all the churches that so-called Lutherans worshiped in were Roman Catholic churches that were now Protestant churches. This building, the building was there, and they built inside this chapel. And Luther, I think, had a hand in designing it, and he was there to consecrate it just 2 years before he died. This is a view of the, looking from the back of the church forward to the altar area and the organ. There's another closer look. This is the altar, ornate in a way, but still very simple. Oh, and by the way, many of the churches and other buildings in the places that we visited have been remodeled over the centuries, added to, changed, and so on. This building, while the paint is fresh, it looks like it did. It was very simple.
The pulpit's on the side of the
I'm going to get to that one. Oops, wrong way. I'm going to talk about the pulpit in a minute. So there's the altar. This is a view from the, and I don't, the one thing that's different about this church, I'm pretty sure in those days there were no chairs. I'm pretty sure you stood for the worship.
Another reason why maybe the pulpits were.
Might have been. Just because if you're standing up, you need to be able to see up higher. This is a view from behind the altar looking to the back of the church, and that balcony up there, that's the royal box. Connected to the castle, the Duke could walk without going outside, down the hallway, come into his box, sit up there, away from all the riffraff who might come into the castle church to worship, and then he could go on about his way. Well, I saw a lot, I took pictures of all the pulpits in all the churches I went to. I fell in love with all these different pulpits. This is my favorite one. This is my favorite one. As you pointed out, it's in the middle of the room, like most of them are. The pulpits in most of the churches were not up at the altar area. It was in the center of the room, so you could address the people more closely. But the way this one is built, now if you're looking at the building, the altar's here, the back of the church, and the pulpit's in the center of the wall there. So on the left side of the three pictures, this is the image that's pointed toward the altar. And it's a depiction of the woman taken in adultery. And you can see she has her hands bound, and this woman has a big rock. This guy's got a bigger rock. They're getting ready to do what the Ten Commandments say that they should do. But Jesus is down here writing in the dirt, as the text tells us in John chapter 8. That story of forgiveness is aimed at the altar where the sacrament of forgiveness is celebrated. Okay? The center panel, and there's Bishop Guy. He got to go up there. I guess I have to be a bishop to try out the pulpits.
You might. Not quite fit, because he's not that tall.
He's not that tall, so I really wonder if I bump my head on there. I would like to try it. The center panel, which is aimed at where the people sit, depicts Jesus, the boy in the temple, teaching the elders. So it's aimed at the congregation that's there to learn God's word. So there's a method to the art here on this pulpit. And they're all looking astounded, like on the right side down the front row, whispering to each other, who is this kid that he knows so much, and so on. Finally, on the far right side, the panel that points up to the Duke's balcony is the depiction of Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple, as if to say, don't abuse the people. So it was Christian art, but it was almost political in the end as well.
Yeah.
I thought that was so cool, the way all that was going on in one pulpit.
So Pastor, how did you get inside the pole? How can you get inside this?
Oh, there is a stairway that runs,
Behind
let's
it?
see if I can show you. I don't think it shows up in any of my pictures there.
That'd be a door in the back.
Well, yeah, so if you can barely see the edge of a doorway right here, and there's a staircase that runs up. Almost all these, they used a lot of spiral staircases in Germany. Boy, you almost got motion sickness climbing up some of them. So, yeah, that was really cool, I thought.
Really good work, too.
Oh, it's beautiful,
And
yeah.
that was built when?
That was dedicated in 1544. 1544. Now, I'm sure it's been probably cleaned up and retouched in anticipation of this year. So there we have that illustration again of the centrality of Christ, the preaching going on, and the attentiveness of the people down below. As I prayed, or Luther asked, pray that God gives you a good mouth and the people a good ear. Communion in both kinds, bread and wine, sacrament of baptism going on the other side. So there's the whole gamut of Reformation worship going on there in one image. So the three parts of the liturgy, notwithstanding the canon of the Mass, which we've talked about, that Luther made the biggest changes in, were the musical parts. Prior to the Reformation, you might get to sing, and also with you.
And that was about
And that's about it. Lift up your hearts. We lift them to the Lord. It is right to give God thanks and praise. That might have been about all you get to sing. Maybe an Alleluia here and there. By and large, all the singing in the service was either chanted by the priest or sung by the choir. So the first thing Luther did is he went to work on the priest's part. He added more to it. But it was in both the Latin and the German masses, it was still sung by the priest. Even the Gospels were chanted. And one goes, he was looking for clarity. Why did he have them sing all that stuff? It's because the architecture made sung voices clearer than spoken voices. With the big stone buildings and all the echoing things, chanting was still the best way to communicate clearly. So that would be an example of that. The second thing he did was enhance the choir's role in the service. And this is a tenor book for the choir to sing their music, and here's the soprano book of the music that they would sing in the service. But the biggest change came with, speaking of, we're going to have another example here. At some points, more often than not, even in the liturgy, what we would call the liturgy, you would get to sing along. And one of the things that he wrote, he didn't write the music for it, although he may have adapted it, was a hymn setting of the creed, sort of a blending of the two creeds into one. So you can read along or sing along as you like, as we hear, we all believe in one true God. We all believe in one true God, who created earth and heaven, the Father who to us in love hath the right of children given. In Son and body feeds us, if you still remember your catechism and your explanation to the first article of the creed, you'll sense that that was blended into the text as well. So teaching the faith was as important as worshiping as faithful people. So that's an example of what you would get to sing along with the choir at that point in the service. Yeah, I think we ought to drag that out, at least have the choir sing it sometime, but no, we shouldn't just have the choir sing it, that would not please Luther. We all want to sing it. It's a bit of work. It's not exactly like, I love to tell the story, but it's, we could learn it and sing that sometime. So, the biggest change that Luther made in all of this musical territory was reforming congregational singing. As I mentioned, prior to the Reformation, basically you didn't get to sing. And after the Reformation, that's what made us as Lutherans famous, is because you could call Luther the father of congregational singing. It's where, you might say, the priesthood of all believers really starts to happen in worship, because everybody's singing together, not just listening. It's not so much a performance for you in the pew anymore. We're all working together to worship.
Mr. Egregious hit.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's missing an E.
I didn't know there was another joke there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't pick that up. So, music came naturally, you might say, to Luther because he learned it as a kid. When he was in school, part of the way they earned their tuition was to sing in the neighborhoods. So he was musical from an early age. He knew how to play the lute, which is no mean trick because that thing's got a bazillion strings on it. And music in the church, music in the home. As I was saying, the home front is as important to him, I think, as the sanctuary for that. Numerous, that would be a lute, yeah. One version, and you can see there's lots of strings on that thing. Many hymnals were started to be produced as early as the 1520s. Mighty Fortress didn't come till later. We'll maybe talk about that a little later in the series. This particular hymnal dates from 1533, was given as a gift to somebody in 1736, which is pretty cool as a gift. And it looks like it was given to somebody else in 1749, if you look down at the bottom right. Another songbook. There were many. I didn't take.
We don't have artwork like that in ours.
Yes, and that was again to supplement the illiteracy. So many woodcuts. Somebody asked at the first session of this, were these all hand done? And no, these were the product of the Gutenberg press, so they could mass produce them and put them into books. But in the 1300s, and you wouldn't have a congregational songbook. We just don't do that. But the priest or the choir would have hand-done copies, of course, if they weren't forced to memorize it, I suppose. And another one with the tune, I don't know what the text is, but there's the tune on the left and all the verses that you would sing, and so on. There's Luther at the lute with the family, and it's more kids than I think he had, although some of them died young. Maybe this is friends, but there's Philip Melanchthon over there on the left of the table again, hanging out. And if you've been in the Luther Museum, there is a mug that bears a striking resemblance to the one that Melanchthon's holding on to that's called Luther's beer mug. So it looked like Philip may be stealing some of Luther's brew. I hadn't even noticed that until
That's why he's hanging out.
Yeah, that's why he's hanging out. Because Luther, and Katie brewed the beer. So,
Oh, that's right.
yeah. So, Christmas, this is an interesting picture too. There's Philip again, hanging on the chair. And it looks, I don't know, for example, for sure what's going on here, but it looks like if this was early enough in his life, it looks like Mom and Dad have gotten shoved in the corners.
Like the grandparents.
There's the grandparents. There's an old man in the right corner and an old lady in the left. I don't know why they aren't at the table, but...
Are they servants?
I don't know. I didn't see a caption. I wanted a picture that showed Luther and his family at Christmas.
But that is a lot.
That is a lot. Whoever they are, maybe, but I don't know that they had servants. That didn't
Yeah,
seem
we
like
just
this
wonder
style.
why would they be in the corner.
I wonder if there are trees ever caught fire.
There are two traditions that associate Luther and Christmas. One is that he invented the Christmas tree. Maybe he did. He saw a tree outside, he brought it in, put lights on it, I guess to symbolize the stars or something. That one might stand up under scrutiny. This one will not. It's thought by many people that Luther wrote Away in a Manger. And in hymnals, that's the title in some cases. But I'm sorry to tell you that's fake news. He didn't write it. It doesn't appear in any German hymnals of that time. It only first appears in English in the 19th century. So take that one off the list. The Christmas tree can stay. But speaking of Christmas, he did write a beautiful Christmas song. He wrote pageants for the home. And if you'll turn to 268, this particular hymn that he wrote, From Heaven Above, may have been written for one of his home Christmas pageants. And I don't think we've ever sung it on Mount Cross, but it's a pretty little hymn.
That's very familiar too.
Yeah, somebody thought it was the same tune as Doxology, but it's not.
No.
But it's a sweet little tune.
Beautiful.
This is, I thought I had switched these pictures, I didn't properly. I have it in my notes. The date's wrong on this. It was not 1529 when the Turks were at the door of Vienna and maybe headed into Germany. It was 1541 when this happened. And the threat was as scary as the plague, and so the Duke, who lived in Wittenberg, asked the pastors of the church to write prayers for the city and for the church and for the nation, I suppose, to protect us. Luther did two better than that. He wrote a special worship service for that purpose and composed a hymn for the purpose. The hymn is in our hymnal, if you want to turn to 517. But I'm going to sing you the original first verse, which does not appear in our hymnal any longer, and you'll probably know why pretty quickly. Lord, keep us in thy word and work. Restrain the murderous Pope and Turk, who fain would tear from off thy throne Christ Jesus, thy beloved Son.
Wow.
Never shy to lay it out there. And it made sense at the time, because the Turk and the Pope were almost equally enemies of the Reformation and of the Church and of the truth, as it were. But that verse has since been replaced in our hymnal, so we can sing along if you wish. So, we have come to the end for this evening. I will
You know
give,
those instruments.
yeah, nice to have a little orchestra like that, wouldn't it? In Next month, the plan is to meet on Tuesday, the 18th, because I will be playing in the concert on Thursday. And the plan is to have Rabbi Mike Lotka here for both the afternoon and the evening session. I'll say that's tentative because I have to respect the fact that while Rabbi Mike is quote-unquote retired, it may be a lot for him to come twice. Even more so for the imam from the mosque in Newbury Park. I don't know where he lives. And to ask him, who's a very busy man, to come twice may not work. So it could be that both sessions are in the evening on July 18th and in August. I'll keep you posted. But for now, we'll plan on the regular schedule. But the Tuesday will be the July date. And as I've given you stuff ahead, this is the topic for August. I don't know if anybody wasn't here last time. I have 3 copies left of the summary of Luther and the Jews that I gave out last time. So, and I almost made it in an hour. Thank you.
We should start really late.
So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you.